Hello and welcome to another edition of TPA Talks. Today we have an absolutely fantastic guest. Her name is Katharine Birbalsingh CBE. She is an education reformer and headmistress of the Michaela Community School in Wembley. And today we're going to be talking all things education. Stay tuned. Katharine, welcome to TPA Talks.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. Take me through this then. So you made a speech to conference in 2010, Conservative conference, about the state of education. 4 years later, you set up the Michaela School. What is it? How did that sort of all come about? And secondly, what is it about your ethos, your style of education that you feel is superior to what a lot of schools have at the moment?
Yeah, well, our school, it's not so much that it doesn't exist anywhere. In fact, I'd say the elements of our school exist in lots of schools. It's just that they tend to exist in a teacher's classroom. So there are some teachers who consider themselves to be progressive and some that consider themselves to be traditional. And the progressives have the desks of the children in groups, and the children are sort of looking at each other. And the teacher might move amongst those desks, keeping the children on task, and consider themselves to be more facilitators of learning rather than teachers. More old-fashioned traditional teacher stands at the front of the class, the desks are in rows, the children are looking at the teacher, and the teacher is the person driving the bus. And I always say, teacher drives the bus, children are on the bus, and you keep them on the bus. So sometimes little Johnny's looking out the window, oh, got to get Johnny back in. Little Amy is chatting to her friend, oh, got to get little Amy back in, and so on. Now, there's a difference there between teacher-led learning or child-led learning. Then there's also a difference. So our teaching methods are different. Now, I say different. There will be teachers across the country who do this. It's just that they are scattered about. At Michaela, all of the teachers do that. And I have to say that over the last 50 or 60 years, there are far fewer of those types of traditional teachers than there used to be. So the PGCE, the training that teachers get to become teachers, it's all progressive. And it really is practically without exception, very progressive. In fact, too often the teacher training institutions don't even recognize the traditional side to things. So, it's, a couple do, but generally speaking, when you do a PGCE, you are bombarded by the progressive viewpoint, and they don't even realize that there is an alternative. And that was certainly the case up until 2010, when Michael Gove, who was the education secretary then, changed things quite substantially, I would say, in this country, so that now there is a discussion about how important knowledge should be in the classroom. It used to be that it wasn't important at all. Nowadays, there's at least a discussion. Should we be focusing more on knowledge, or should we be focusing more on skills? The progressives are about skills. The traditionalists are more about knowledge. So we are a school that's filled with traditionalists. And so our teaching methods are different across the board in that way. And then the other way in which we're different is in terms of behavior. Now, there are other schools where behavior will be strict, is what I'd say. We're not the only ones on that. I suppose it's the combination of both the traditional teaching and the strict behavior that is more rare. And what do we mean by that? Well, we have corridors that are silent. People get very annoyed about that. They say, why would you do this to children? I always say, well, the alternative of them beating each other up in the corridors is not very nice. I don't know why, why people have such a problem with silence. It means that the children move very quickly to their lessons in about a minute and a half. It maximizes our lesson time. When you have children arriving at school with the reading age of a 7-year-old, when they are in fact 11 years old, you want as much time in the lessons as possible in order to catch them up. So it's important to remember that about 20% of our children at 16 leave school functionally illiterate and functionally enumerate. And when people say, oh, you're oppressing children, I'll tell you what's really oppressive: not being able to read for your whole life, not being able to count your change in a shop, So I think it's really important that children get taught these basics. And I think that it's best done through traditional fashion with high expectations of behavior. Now, our values are also can be considered to be relatively different nowadays. I think 50 years ago, all schools would have thought like this, which is that we teach personal responsibility, we teach gratitude, we teach a sense of duty to one's family and to one's community. And so, yeah, anybody's ever seen The Crown? I just saw The Crown for the first time in the last few days, and it's so fantastic, all about duty and the sense of personal responsibility and doing what's right for one's country, It's just all of those values are everywhere in The Crown, and it's all the same thing here. It's just part of who we are. Whereas I'd say nowadays in 2020, there's much more of a me culture. Very much, what can I get? I'm not doing that unless I'm being paid, or I'm not doing that unless, there's something in it for me. Whereas we just have a very different way of looking at things. So, yeah, those are the big ways in which we differ. My speech at the time, I was just trying to ring some alarm bells to say, look, I think there are things that we could do better. That doesn't mean there aren't good schools out there. I'm just talking about I was talking about the general system and the way in which I thought it was failing both children and teachers, actually. And that when we're pouring over 90 billion into the education system every year, we ought to expect more, really. And the worst of it is that teachers are working really hard. They're killing themselves. I've known many a broken teacher in my life. And it's not a question of people not working hard. And I think that people are really mistaken when they think, teachers are just lazy. I mean, there are some lazy teachers, I suppose, but generally speaking, they're not. It's that they're just doing the wrong things in the classroom. And it's not their fault, because they've been taught to do this by the teacher training colleges. And in fact, their senior teams hold them to account by insisting that they teach badly, is what I'd say. So, of course, everything I'm saying is hugely controversial. And if someone were arguing with me here, they would just say, no, that's not true. The way in which we teach in our schools is correct. But I would point to results. I would point to the huge number of deprived children who don't manage to get to the best universities, who leave school not being able to read and write. Forget about getting to university, I think these are basics. In a developed country like ours, all of our children should be able to leave school with the basics, and they just don't.
So picking up on a few points there, it sounds like effort has to go into not just educating the children in a certain way, but also making sure you've got teachers who are up to spec as well. And I'm guessing you put some sort of time into that side of things. You mentioned the huge amounts of money that we spend on education in this country. Is it a case, do we need to spend more money, or is it the case that we could spend the same and get better results, or even spend less and get better results? What's your sort of take on that?
I don't know about spending less. As a head mistress, I'm always wanting more money. Great to have more. So but obviously you work within your means. So you don't provide something that you could otherwise provide if you had more money. We as our building, for instance. And this is because we're a free school, so we had to fight everybody in order to open. Like, as you said, in 2010, I gave this speech. I then chose very soon after that to, because I was out of a job and so on, I was told I would never work in the state sector again. So I thought, right, well, if I want to work with the children I've worked with all my life, which are deprived children from the inner city, I'm going to have to set up my own school. It was the only way I could kind of get back into teaching. And so I started setting one up. It took me 3.5 years before this place opened. We had to move 3 different boroughs in London because everyone was fighting us, trying to stop us from opening. I used to say, gosh, you'd think we were building nuclear arms. I don't understand. We're just trying to set up a school, But people were some people, obviously, not everyone, the poor mums who I would meet in Brixton Market or, across the city, who were desperate for another choice of school, they weren't against us. It was essentially the white middle class parents, well, not parents, there were no parents, white middle class people who were bussed in from outside of London to come to our parents' events and infiltrate them and sit amongst the actual parents who wanted to send their children to the school. And so that when I would speak, they would jump up and start jeering and shouting to stop me. Oh, I'm sorry. Those are our kids who are at school.
That's quite all right. Not a problem at all. Why were these parents so against what you were trying to do? What was their rationale for it? Surely, you're someone who was trying to make education better for as many kids as possible. How could they possibly be against that?
Okay, but let me just make clear, I misspoke when I said that. So they're not parents. These are just people. Often they're young people in their 20s who don't have children themselves, who would come to the event in order to stop us because they were very much against free schools. So the reason why people are against free schools is because they're very much for union power. And when the schools are all controlled by the councils and by the unions, then they just have more power. They call a strike and everybody marches out. Whereas free schools are outside of that. And therefore, the unions feel that their power is being threatened. So essentially, if you find people who are anti-free school, it tends to be that they're just very pro-union. And the people who are pro-free school tend to be anti-union. I'm pro-free school because I believe it gives a real sense of ownership to the people who are working in the school. So Michaela is very much our school, and we all believe in certain values. And I've been able to bring together like-minded people who we all believe in traditionalism, and we're all able to deliver on that goal, which is different from in a more normal school where people sort of come and go, and then they go to a different school, and then they go to another job. There isn't necessarily, I mean, sometimes there is, so I don't want to say always, but there isn't necessarily that same kind of commitment to a particular goal, to a particular vision. And so that's why I like free schools. I think they really work because they kind of get the balance between the state. So the school is state owned. The school acts just like any other state school. It takes in similar kinds of kids. It has the same admissions policy. All of that's the same. But when it comes to the kind of culture in the school, you can, if you want, it doesn't always happen with free schools, but if you want, you're able to create a very unique culture much, much more easily, I think, when you've got a free school.
And you don't actually have a choice over which children you receive, as I understand it. It's sort of purely random selection by the council. I think people could state a preference for your school, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get it. So it's not like a grammar school where you're sort of getting the top scorers in an exam. So going back to those sort of schools that are still, I say run by the union, but union influence, shall we say? I assume you get sort of roughly the same selection of kids. Does your school tend to outperform those union schools?
Yeah, well, I mean, in 2019, I mean, this year was, all the results were kind of teacher assessed. So I can't really refer to that, but I'll refer to 2019, which had our first set of GCSE results. We were 5th best in the country in terms of our progress to 8. So we did do very well in terms of the GCSE results. In terms of admissions, so our school is just like all the other schools around here. The council sends you kids in September. The way it works for all schools is that you have 5 or 6 choices on your application. You apply through your council, and they try to give you your first choice or your second choice or your third choice. But often you won't necessarily get your first choice, your second choice, but they try. And then they place everybody out. To be honest, it's all a bit of a mystery about how the council does all of this. I don't really understand it, but they just send you a bunch of kids. And our school is just like any other school. I mean, there's no, because you said that they can prefer and so on. I mean, no more so than any other school. I mean, it's exactly the same.
Do you think your school would be, if parents could say, yes, I want to go to the Michaela school, do you think your school would be much more oversubscribed than any other school in the area as a result of the ethos that you promote and the results that you've achieved?
So I find that we get some of the two extremes. We can get children who are completely spinning out of control and real nightmare, and they think, oh, that's that school that's a bit of an army school, let's send him there. But then we can also get kids who've been badly bullied and so on at other schools, and their parents think, oh, let's get him here because he'll be well looked after here. But then we also just get lots of kids who live nearby. What I find is that for the most part, parents just tend to choose the school that's next door. And they'll apply to, there's 3 schools that are quite close to each other here, and they'll apply to all 3. And then they just kind of hope, and wherever the council puts them, they go to that school. If their brother or sister went to the school before, well, they go to that school. And if they were kind of happy enough with it, they send their child there. People aren't as, the white middle classes are different, right? So they're different. They're all the elbow, we talk about, what are they called? They elbow people out. There's an expression. Anyway, out of the way. White middle class is very different. They move house. They buy new houses to get their kids into a certain catchment area. They'll pay for private schools. Now that's not just, you'll have some hardworking, poor families as well who work really hard to be able to get their children to private schools. So I'm not just saying it's just rich people. But the fact is that the parents who are around here, it's very different. It tends to be, and not just here, in every school I've ever worked in London, people just tend to send their child to the local school, and they don't have the same, I'm kind of outraged by education and I think it needs to change for the better. And I talk about it all the time. They're a lot more relaxed, I'd say, a lot more relaxed than I am.
That's interesting, because I know in America they've had tremendous success, similar to free schools, with charter schools. And the thing I've always sort of gleaned from that is that parents actually, will fight tooth and nail to get their children into these charter schools because they're so much better than the local ones. So that's really quite interesting.
Well, hang on. There's a reason. The difference is because they actually have some control over whether or not the child gets into the charter school in America. Because if you want to go to the charter school, you have to apply specifically to the charter school, and then there's lottery. Whereas here, our school is just like any other school. So nobody knows that there's any difference. It's just another school. So that's why. And in fact, it's a very good example, what you say there, of how the state influences mindset. People often disregard the effects of the state. So they just think, oh, well, let's just get the state to give people more money, or let's just get the state to do more for X, Y, and Z. And they don't think about the unintended consequences. So what they've done there, and I'm not necessarily criticizing them, I get it. I get why free schools are considered to be just normal schools, and that they're part of the normal admissions process, and that you apply to it just like any other school, and that the local people aren't necessarily told that's a free school. You call this Michaela Free School. In fact, we're Michaela Community School. So they would have no idea. There's nothing free on our website. The word is never used. So we're just on the list of schools, just like all the other schools. And so they just choose us if they want us, and that's it. As they would do any other school. And I say choose us, they might choose us first, second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth. And what that suggests, actually, given what you've said, is that because the system is different for how people apply in America, the state has not influenced, it's not taken away their agency. What I find the state does too often is it removes people's self-determination and agency to take control of their lives and own their lives and make something of it. And so if they think, well, there isn't much, I don't have much choice in this, I'm just going to get put into a school, then they don't actively engage in the process because, well, they're not going to have any impact. It's not going to have any impact anyway. Do you see? Whereas, and what you're saying is, but the inner city kids in America, they do engage, their families engage. And it's a really good point, because they engage because the state has not involved itself on the same in charter schools in the way that the state has involved itself in free schools here. And when it comes to schooling, I think I am on the right. I mean, sadly, the left have given up that position. I think maybe 60, 70 years ago, many of our small c conservative values, actually, I think would have been held by both the right and the left. Sadly, the modern left have given up those values. They don't believe in that stuff anymore. So, yeah, I am on the right.
It's strange, isn't it, about the wasting money side of things? Is what I always say to people who disagree. So I say, well, you may not want to cut taxes, but surely we can agree that wasting money is not a good thing, and not always everyone agrees with that. So it's it's a strange one.
Well, it's not that they're not actively saying we want to waste money. They're just saying the obvious reason why schools are failing is because of a lack of money. And so what we need is to fix the money situation before we try and fix anything else. And I would say that is patently not true, because there are some good schools with the same amount of money as some of the bad schools. So obviously you can use the money differently and get a good outcome. So yeah, I mean, look, it depends on what you want to offer people. I have $4,500 or so per child to be able to give them an education. If you go to one of the top private schools, you're looking at about $25,000 per child. So obviously I do not offer karate and hapkido and aikido and
fencing.
Judo. I mean, literally, you'll have about 6 or 7 different martial arts offered in these private schools. And we don't offer a single martial art. We don't offer Russian and German and all sorts. We just offer French. Now, it depends on what people think the state should do. If they think the state should offer the same as the private sector, well, then clearly we need a lot more money. But if we think the state's role is to offer at least a basic education, then what we're getting is fine. Now, if we then say, well, but why is it not succeeding at offering the basic education? Well, that's when it gets interesting. And I would argue that if we had our teachers all standing at the front, if we all believed in the authority of the teacher and of adults generally, if we believed in instilling a sense of personal responsibility in our children and a sense of duty, if we had our desks facing the teacher and the teacher was driving the bus, all the things I've spoken about, I think we would do a lot better with the same amount of money that we've got.
Well, I very much agree with you, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would. Let's move on to the coronavirus, if we may, and how that's affected education. I think I read recently that, and you may disagree with this, but that a number of schools have been criticised for the way or the lack of how they've been teaching children who've been stuck at home, basically. And there's been all sorts of talk about children not having access to electronic devices. And I was just wondering how the Michaela Community School has coped with this, and have you been able to innovate better than others, and how have you dealt with these very challenging circumstances?
Yeah, they have been challenging. I mean, when we were in lockdown, we had a system where every family would receive a phone call once a week by one of the teachers at school, and we had everybody kind of divided up, and we had a little spreadsheet where you kind of tick to say you'd phoned home and had a conversation. So that helped to keep children motivated, because the thing is, if you just give them work, then they're not, especially in the inner city, they're just not going to do it. Depending on the year group, so we did some Zoom lessons, and then we did video lessons, and then we also had work coming in on Google Classroom. And so my teachers were working really hard during that whole period, getting in work, marking it, talking to the kids, ringing the kids, doing Zoom lessons in actual time. There was lots going on. Having said that, the problem with not being in school is that you can't hold the children to account. So if you're the type of child who has a family at home who are going to make you work, then you're okay. But our children, that's just not like that. So, I mean, there's a few of them where that's the case, but mostly that's not the case. And so the children came back, and while they were doing the work, and I say doing it, I mean, they were doing it, but they weren't really learning it properly. So we found that they just came back, and we were having to start again with most of the stuff that we'd been teaching throughout the Zoom period. Right now, it's an issue because if I have to send a class home, which I have had to do on a couple of occasions, they're at home for 14 days because somebody's tested positive, so they have to go home. Their bubble has to go home. And it means, again, we're doing Zoom lessons, but they don't really learn very much. And when they come back, they're all exhausted, and they're exhausted because they've been up on their phones every night till 3 or 4 in the morning. They've just been left to do nothing for 2 weeks. And even though we're doing stuff with them, it really is nothing in comparison to what they do in lessons. So it's absolutely true when people say that this situation is going to negatively affect the disadvantaged. And when I say disadvantaged, I don't necessarily mean the very poorest of society. I mean children who don't have parents who are able to support them properly with their learning at home.
With this, we've just got to really hope that things return to normal as soon as possible.
Yes.
You mentioned smartphones. Now, I think it's fair to say you're not a fan of children having smartphones.
No.
Could you just tell us a bit about that and why it is? Because we sort of hear, these days, we've got to get kids iPads, and I think in some schools they even pay for the children to have iPads. I think it's quite a big thing. I know California bought children a load of iPads.
Yes.
And they all got damaged, unfortunately, and it probably ended up costing a fortune. But what's your sort of thoughts on the sort of smartphones and the role that technology can play for educating children?
Well, it's not just California. I would say that's the case in most schools. I mean, if they don't give them the iPads to take home, the schools all have iPads in. I mean, most schools have iPad trolleys, and then the kids use the iPads and put them back in, and they're being used in lessons regularly. That's perfectly normal. And they also have laptop trolleys, and they take them around and then they use them. And I mean, even we will use laptops now and again, but it really is, for homework, really. I mean, it's not something we would use in a lesson. The problem is government went to all that trouble during lockdown to get poor children laptops. What they don't realize is that they will be using that technology in order to access Snapchat and Instagram. So yes, the problem is now, in order to access their work, they need to have technology. But technology is really bad for them because actually they won't use it to access their work. They'll use it to access Snapchat and Instagram. So I would say to all of your listeners that they must watch the film The Social Dilemma. It's on Netflix. And in fact, it's such an important film that yesterday after school, I had my entire staff body watch the film together in the upper hall. It's called The Social Dilemma, and it's all about social media and what it's doing to our world. And in particular, it talks a little bit about children, but honestly, if you have a child, do not give them a phone. The reason why you don't want to give them a phone is because it gives them unsupervised access to the internet. And unsupervised access means that they will be on Instagram and Snapchat. And you need to stop them. And WhatsApp, the most awful places where they get bullied, where they are made to, anxiety, depression, mental health issues have skyrocketed in the last 10 years because of social media, in particular for young girls. When I say young girls, 10 to 14, but even in the older ones, it's shocking what goes on. We've had a situation here where even a pedophile was after one of our children. Mother had no idea. He was getting in and out of the shower, telling this to the girl. I cannot tell you the horror stories. And parents don't realize. So they think they save up their money really nicely. They save up their money for Christmas, and then they give their child the phone, and they think they're doing them a favor. They are making their children into addicts who will not be able to get off their phones, who will stop doing their homework, who will meet undesirables. That's how the boys get involved in gangs. That's how the girls get their older boyfriends and get led astray. I'm telling you, all I can say to all parents is, trust me, don't give them a phone. They may need a laptop to do their work. Always watch their screen. Always know what they're doing.
If Boris Johnson came to you and said, I'm putting you in charge of education tomorrow, where would you start? What would you do? What would you improve? Your chance to put your mark on the nation's education.
Yeah, I think you need to try and win hearts and minds in terms of the changes that are required. Like I said, teachers standing at the front, more traditional teaching, traditional behavior systems. I don't know. I'd want to put a few people in a van together to kind of go around visiting schools and giving suggestions and saying, look, this is what can be done. Maybe having a few big conferences around the country where I or others might talk about the benefits of traditionalism, to try and persuade them that way. And then get them visiting schools like Michaela, where they can see how different things could be if they were to just change the way in which they think, and then try and pair up. So perhaps try and put in some of these traditionalist type teachers into different schools to try and help change the way in which some of these schools are doing things. I mean, not everywhere. You want to start with whoever is willing and wanting to do that. And there are schools that are doing that and are different. I mean, there's a school I can think of in the Midlands. They call themselves the Michaela of the Midlands, There are various schools that have come to visit. We get over 600 visitors a year coming to see us, and they take ideas and they go back to their schools. I suppose I just want to get more of that happening. At the moment, it's just happening on the ground because people just take it upon themselves to go and do their own personal development. I'd want to turbo boost that from government, really.
We talked earlier about parents having more choice in where their child goes to school. One of the ideas that's been floated a few times in this country is the idea of a voucher system. So rather than the sort of £4,500 sort of, that you typically spend on a child going to you at the school, it goes to the parent, and then the parent has the choice where they, which school they want to spend the money with. Now, that's not to say that your school would probably be oversubscribed, I suspect, and then you'd probably have to have a lottery anyway, or maybe even, dare I say, you might want to have an entrance exam or something like that. But is a voucher system something that would maybe, you were talking about the state sort of takes away the autonomy of the individual? Do you think that's a possible model that could work, or is there something else that you would like to see to put more power into the hands of parents and, I suppose, ultimately their children as a result?
Well, you're talking about two different things, because you mentioned selection and being able to select according to ability. And then you've also mentioned this voucher system. Now, the thing about the voucher system, it's kind of no different really from what currently exists. You supposedly get your first choice. I mean, the fact is, everybody can't get their first choice because there aren't enough schools, the kinds of schools that people want. So when you take your voucher, well, why is it that one voucher would be worth more than another voucher? When those two people both want the one place at the school, well, how do you decide between them? The voucher system doesn't solve the problem. Really, what we need are more of those kinds of schools that people want to go to. which is why I say we need to go around trying to create those schools, because vouchers wouldn't really make any difference. Now, selection is another point, which is an interesting one. I'm not necessarily against selection in theory. I used to be very anti-grammar school, and I think I've changed my mind on that. I don't know, for the very top, I mean, I don't mean, because at the moment grammar schools are not the top 5% at all. They're kind of the top 35% or something. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the very top. Possibly you might want to have a grammar system for them. When I went to India and visited various schools there, I found that all of their schools were kind of were graded and we're kind of on a hierarchy. So, you would be paying for one school here, and then there was the public school system, but nobody really wanted to go to the public school system because it was considered not to be very good. So people were paying to get and they might be paying, 100 rupees a month in this school, but when you get a bit more money, you're going to get to that school where you're paying 200 rupees a month, and then to that school where you're paying 300 rupees. And all of the families were sort of working to kind of get themselves up that ladder. And that is interesting because there's a very clear hierarchy about which are the better schools. Not just that there are grammar schools and everybody else, but that there are actually all of the schools are in this hierarchy. It did mean that people were a lot more engaged. They're a lot more engaged in what school their child is going to, because they feel they're trying to work harder to get the child into the better school. And I am very wary of the state's power when it influences people's agency and self-determination and rids them of it. And too often on the left, I think people just assume that people are born disengaged. Well, they're just not. I mean, I think they've been made that way. You don't find people in India or in South Africa or in Nigeria or in Jamaica. I'm just thinking about the various countries, like China. I've been to all of these countries and looked at their schools. You don't find these people there being upset because you don't find them not being upset, but being disengaged and not really caring so much. They do very much. And they're all working really hard to get the child into the best school. So why should our people be any different? And I would say it's about the generosity of the welfare state.
I think you may well be right. Katharine, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We're gonna have to leave it there. But I thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having on. Before you go, if people want to find out more about Michaela School, or maybe even set up their own free school, where can they find out more information about your school, and how would you recommend they go about setting up their free school if they were so inclined?
Well, New Schools Network is where you go to if you want to set up a free school. You just go online and find them. You can find me on Twitter at Miss_Snuffy, SNUFFY. And our school, you just Google Michaela Community School, you'll find our website and you'll find all about us.
From us at the TPA, a big thank you, and we wish you every success and indeed your pupils all the success in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this edition of TPA Talks. If you have done so already, please subscribe to us on YouTube or follow us on Twitter or Facebook for all the latest taxpayer news.